ticket to him. He has done that. The security are running from everywhere. Now, he played on last time from here. I was about to say, what would happen if he played on the siren went?
So he cannot improve the angle. So, for 90 years, the Collingwood Footy Club have held the record, and for 62 years, it stood at 12.99. Will he write his name in the record book forever?
Come on, Clow.
With this kick, it's going to go. He's done it. And aren't we privileged?
It's been 121 years since AFL's inception, and as you can imagine, there's an incredible amount of records out there. Many new players begin their careers every year, but only a select few are deserving of their names being etched into the history books forever. Today we're going to be taking a look back at 5 AFL records that will not or are very unlikely to be beaten ever again.
Oh, he's done it.
He might be oblivious to it, but the crowd know. They've kicked 37 goals. They have equalled the all-time goals record in a game. And we've got...
On to Knights. Knights wrong, puts himself. This could go anywhere. Payton. No. Who's feeding off the pack? Folds. Ablett goes in. Justin Madden. Tuck. This will be a great goal. Oh, he's kicked it. Great goal, Tuck. An enormous goal. Absolutely.
Michael Tuck's illustrious career helped make quite a name for himself. He once held the AFL VFL record of 426 games over 20 seasons, and due to his longevity, holds a couple tough records to beat. Beginning and ending his career at Hawthorn, Tuck played in a record-breaking 11 grand finals while netting himself a record 7 premierships. A tall and wiry frame, Tuck made his debut in round 8 of 1971 as a full forward.
How many years did you play with Bill? Just tell us a bit about yourself.
I played about 6 years, about 5 in the juniors and 1 year in the seniors, and then I got invited up to Hawthorn.
However, after being tried in a few different positions, including wing and defence, it wasn't until 1974 that Tuck would find his niche and establish himself as a ruck rover in the centre alongside AFL greats Lee Matthews and Don Scott. In 1975, Tuck played in his first grand final, losing to a strong North Melbourne outfit. But it was just 1 year later that Tuck would taste premiership glory for the first time, defeating North Melbourne in a grand final rematch in front of over 110,000 people packed into the G. The 80s started off slow for Hawthorn, missing finals completely in 1980 and 81 before recovering and playing in the 1983 preliminary final only to fall short of another grand final berth. It was 1983 that began Tuck's charge into the record books. Hawthorn's dominance throughout the 80s and early 90s led Tuck to featuring in 8 of 9 grand finals and winning 5 of them, 4 as captain.
Michael Tuck, congratulations. How many's that you played in?
That's a 9.
How many winning ones? 5 winning ones. Do they get better all the time?
No, they do, yeah.
While one might argue that he was a man in the right place at the right time, you can't argue that Tuck was an integral part of the Hawthorn side for nearly 2 decades. It would be the strength of Hawthorn over this time span, however, that would aid Tuck in achieving his final unbreakable record. Over 426 games and 20 seasons of football, Tuck was unable to win a Club Best and Fairest award, setting the record for most amount of games played without having won one. Michael Tuck retired following the 1991 Premiership win against West Coast, finalising his unbreakable grand final and premiership tally record, as well as most games played without a single Club Best and Fairest award.
Made history in round 22 of 1990. The newspapers of the day announced Essendon's 4 Danaher brothers would line up against St Kilda, all in key positions and all together in the one AFL side for the first and only time.
The Danahers are practically football royalty. Between the 4 brothers, they've played 752 senior AFL games, including 6 premierships. Terry would be the first Danaher to arrive at Essendon. Despite having decided on signing with Fitzroy, a last-minute call from Essendon was enough to sway Terry's mind to join the Bombers for the 1978 season alongside his brother Neil. In 1987, the other 2 Danaher brothers joined Essendon, with one being drafted and the other coming from the Sydney Swans. This would set the stage for arguably the greatest Danaher and Neil ever plagued by injury, playing his last game alongside 3 of his brothers.
Spend time with my brothers at the football club. Now looking back now, special time.
Given the differences in the draft in the present time, it's extremely unlikely that we'll ever see this happen again. Footballers come in all different shapes, sizes and ages. While some wait years to finally play at the highest level, for Claude Clow it took just 15 years and 209 days. Unfortunately, Clow made his debut in 1900, and so there is absolutely no photos or very little information on the team. Although his debut in round 1 proved to be quite historic, with St Kilda drawing with Melbourne only for a point scored by the D's in the third quarter to be disallowed, and so a week after the game was played, the Saints had won their first match since their inception in 1987, snapping a losing streak of 48 consecutive losses in a row. Just as Clow had had to wait for his first ever win, he'd also have to wait to be crowned the youngest player to ever play the game. In 2012, research by official AFL historians showed that Clow was in fact younger than first thought, changing his birth year to 1884 from the previously thought 1880, and so forever solidifying his spot at the top of the record books. Clow, a half forward, kicked 8 goals in 23 games and retired at 16 in 1901. Due to the physicality, skill and speed of the game being harder than ever before, a different drafting system and an age eligibility of 18, this record will certainly never be broken again. Now let's talk about the other end of the scale, the oldest player to play the game, because footballing legend Vic Cumberland was 43 years old when he decided to hang up the boots, making him the oldest man to play in VFL AFL history. Cumberland's ability to play at such a mature age may be thanks to a slightly peculiar career. The ruckman made his debut for Melbourne in 1898, where he played 50 games over 4 years before having a year off in 1902 and later joining St Kilda in 1903. After the 1904 season, Cumberland again took time out of the VFL, instead travelling to New Zealand to play in the Auckland League until the conclusion of the 1906 season. He again joined St Kilda, establishing himself as one of the most talented players and ruckmen in the league, despite only standing 5'11". Unsurprisingly, Cumberland continued to take breaks from the VFL, travelling and playing in multiple different leagues, including a 3-year stint at Sturt, netting him the 1911 Magarey medal. He was quickly establishing himself as somewhat of a footballing nomad. Cumberland's last game would come in 1920, 4 years after his previous footballing stint, having served for the Australian Army in World War I, and so, at 43 years and 48 days of age, retired the oldest player to ever play the game. Just as I said previously for the youngest player record, the demands of the modern game would likely prove too tough, making this record unbreakable.
Walters is on, Hill keeps going, this to send them into a home preliminary final for the first time in their history.
Here's Coleman at his brilliant best. Yes, he takes a fine mark there with some clever juggling.
In 1993, the AFL Rising Star Award tradition started. It rewarded new players to the game for exceptionally good performances. If this award were around in 1949, then John Coleman's performance against Hawthorn at Windy Hill in round 1 would surely have picked up a nomination, and probably would have won him the award just off that game alone. Just 20 years of age, running out with Essendon for his first game, you wouldn't be blamed if you thought he was some freak from a different state league. He had freakish aerial ability along with superb ground skills, as well as deadly accuracy in front of goal to punish any opponent.
I was 9 years old, barracking for Essendon, lived in Essendon, and Coleman, 5 goals in his first quarter of VFL football. Amazing. And then he went on to kick 12 that day and became a superstar overnight. It was a wonderful start to a great career.
Now, Coleman certainly wasn't no one-hit wonder. The Coleman Medal, the award for most goals kicked in the home and away season, is of course named after John. And rightly so. Coleman certainly lived up to his potential after his breakout game, kicking 100 or more goals 3 times, leading league goal kickers 4 times, and holding an incredible average goals per game of 5.48. This places John second in the record books for highest goals per game average. To add to his legacy, Coleman is a 2-time premiership player with Essendon. Many believe there may have been a third had the star forward not been suspended for the 1951 Grand Final. Ever improving, John Coleman was only young and he looked set to rewrite the goal-kicking records. But one devastating day at Windy Hill in June 1954 changed that forever. Coleman suffered a dislocated knee along with cartilage and ligament damage. After 2 knee operations and repeated comeback attempts, Coleman would never play again. Interestingly enough, this knee injury could be treated in just 6 weeks today, according to AFL Medical Commissioner Harry Unglick. Coleman gave up the game, retiring at just 25 after 98 senior games for Essendon, just 5 years after his debut. His final goal tally stands at a whopping 537 goals. In the modern game, draftees are often much less developed mentally and physically, and thus can find it a bit tougher to be competitive with the more senior players in the early parts of their career. There's no doubting John Coleman was ahead of his time, so much so that his record of 12 goals on debut will remain unbroken forever.
When Port Adelaide gets into grand finals, it wins them. When Geelong plays off in the big ones, it doesn't.
Andrew Mackie can join the veritable orgy of Geelong goal kickers. He drives through another. The Cats are in heaven.
The 2007 AFL Grand Final is one of the most iconic games in history. Even the most casual of footy fans know what fate 22 Port Adelaide players suffered on the 29th of September 2007. I'm of course talking about the absolute belting Port Adelaide suffered at the hands of Geelong in front of over 97,000 people at the MCG. Geelong kicked 24 goals and 19 behinds to Port Adelaide's 6 goals and 8 behinds, losing by a massive 119 points. The magnitude of this loss was amplified by the fact that it was a grand final, and so the biggest ever winning or losing margin, depending on how you choose to look at it, is 119 points. Geelong entered the 2007 season in some fine form, proving that they were destined to perform better than the year previous, where they had finished 10th on the ladder. Port Adelaide also entered the 2007 season in great form, and they too would perform well enough to best the previous year's efforts of 12th place. Come the end of the 2007 home and away season, and Geelong and Port Adelaide sit 1 and 2 on the ladder with a win-loss record of 18-4 and 15-7 respectively. Geelong would face the Kangaroos in the first final, defeating them by a massive 106 points to lock in a second week finals bye before taking on and beating Collingwood by just 5 points in the preliminary final. Port Adelaide's road to the finals was much the same, but in reverse. They hosted the Eagles at Amy Stadium and went on to win by just 3 points after leading all night. Having also earned a second finals week bye, Port prepared to face North Melbourne the following week, going on to defeat them by 87 points in the preliminary final. And thus the stage seemed set. The 2007 AFL Grand Final would be Port Adelaide vs Geelong, two dominant teams who finished 1 and 2 on the ladder. But to make things more interesting, the two teams' head-to-head record for 2007 was 1 and 1. Geelong had had a comfortable win over Port Adelaide in round 9 of the same year, while the rematch would bring us Dominic Cassisi's classic match-winning goal, which would come 3 seconds before the final siren at Skilled Stadium in round 21, breaking the hearts of Geelong fans everywhere.
Cassisi to win it. Cassisi does win it.
Nobody could have predicted the carnage that would ensue when the ball was bounced to start the grand final. Almost immediately it seemed the Cats had Port on the back foot. Geelong would go on to outscore Port Adelaide 5 goals 7 behinds to 2 goals 2 behinds. And while it was a nervous time for Port supporters, many hoped it would just be the result of nerves and things would be turned around shortly. But this wouldn't be so, and within the first 12 minutes of the second quarter, the Cats had piled on another 5 goals to stretch the margin to 52 points. It wasn't long after this that spectators realised that the Power were not up to the challenge, and it seemed like the players knew so too. A moment that really stands out for me, that really shows the difference in hunger between the two teams, was when the 6'8" ruckman Brad Otten chased down a much smaller and agile player in Michael Pettigrew. Looking back at this today, this perhaps could have been an omen for what was to come.
He would dearly not want to concede another one. Pettigrew, a man who can run, you can see he's quite confident, striding out against Brad Ottens, but maybe overconfident.
That is a victory. That is a victory of the highest order to see the ruckman run down a dasher.
It came as no surprise that after Geelong's 12-minute purple patch in the second quarter, that they would continue to coast along to a cruisy win. Key forward Cam Mooney redeemed his grand final day record and slotted 5 goals for the day. Meanwhile, half forwards Steve Johnson and Paul Chapman kicked 4 goals each and set up numerous others, with a young Nathan Ablett also kicking 3. The depth of Geelong's midfield was far too strong for the Power, with Gary Ablett Jr., Jimmy Bartell, Joel Corey, James Kelly, Joel Selwood and Cameron Ling all rotating through the midfield. In a game of pure dominance, it's unsurprising that the Norm Smith medalist would then hail from the Cattery, with Steve Johnson taking him home.
And Ken said, Stevie, over here. He's trying to get the forwards together for a huddle. And I just pretended I didn't hear him. He said, Stevie. And by about the 5th time, I thought, I better turn around for the huddle. So I turned around to Kenny and said, Kenny, it's not Stevie. Call me Norm. So I was, I'd already sort of thought to myself that I might have the Norm Smith medal that day, but
well, it turned out to be true.
And as it turned out, it was true.
The Cats broke their 44-year premiership drought and built the foundations for an era of dominance throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s. On the other hand, for Port Adelaide, the defeat would mark the start of major issues at Alberton, slumping to the bottom half of the ladder for the next 6 years, all the while racking up high margin losses. The 119-point loss would break the previous record of 96 points set by Hawthorn against Melbourne in the 1988 VFL Grand Final. It would also be the biggest loss ever since Port Adelaide's inception into the AFL in 1997. In 1988, if you would have asked me whether or not the biggest Grand Final loss record would ever be beaten, I'd tell you that you're crazy. But almost 20 years later, Port Adelaide achieved the unthinkable, and this time, I'm confident in saying that no team will ever have a higher loss margin in a grand final.